Okay, so welcome everyone to the second seminar of the Politics of Archives and Struggles for Emancipation. For those that did not attend the first seminar, this series brings together Middle Eastern and Southern African scholars, archivists, artists, and filmmakers to share archival practices and experiences that seek to produce counter-hegemonic and emancipatory narratives. This online initiative is the more visible facade of a broader project on the politics of archives initiated by the Institut français du Proche-Orient, Wits History Workshop, Birzeit University, the Institute for Palestine Studies, the Observatory of the Arab and Muslim Worlds, and IFAS research. Today's seminar focuses on the politics of film archives after liberation, particularly the ways films, as memory fragments and traces of history, can contribute to reproduce or unsettle past, but also to reimagine alternative futures. We will also discuss the challenges of working with film archives in the current political moment, particularly concerning access, indexing, copyrights,
I'm on Zoom for echo.
And visibility. To address these and other questions, we're delighted to have with us Jihan Tahri and Sifiso Khanyile, two wonderful and award-winning filmmakers who have a long experience in digging, studying, and critically engaging with colonial and liberation archives. Jihan Tahri is a film director, writer, visual artist, and producer. She has been a member of the Academy Oscars since 2017 and is currently on the selection committee of the Locarno International Film Festival. She has directed more than 15 films, and her visual art exhibitions have traveled to renowned museums and several biennales around the world. Her writings include Les 7 vies de Yasser Arafat and Israel and the Arabs, the 50 Years' War. She continues to mentor and direct various documentary and filmmaking labs. Jihan has also served on the boards of several African film organizations, including the Federation of Pan-African Cinema and the Guild of African Filmmakers in the Diaspora. Sifiso Khanyile is a Johannesburg-based filmmaker and archive researcher. He's also a member of the International Emmys. Sifiso has produced 9 films, writing and directing 4 of those, including 3 award-winning documentaries, Uprise, A New Country, and The Reclaimers. His work is concerned with memory and history and how they continue to shape contemporary imaginations of South Africa. His ongoing project, Black Joy Under Apartheid, foregrounds Black leisure and pleasure under apartheid to offer counter-hegemonic narratives to Black victimhood. Sifiso is currently writing his debut narrative feature, Problematique. My name is Omar Jabari Salamanca, and I'm the co-director of the Observatory of the Arab and Muslim Worlds at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and I'll be moderating today's session. I must say that I'm really excited to have this event included in our series because very often film and audiovisual culture are often marginalized in the social sciences, which tend to fetishize text and textual archives. I would also like to thank Matselitso Motsoane, who is the one that put me in touch with Sifiso, and as it turns out, Sifiso and Jihan also knew each other, so it was a perfect match. The idea for the seminar today is to have a conversation rather than back-to-back presentations. I'll be asking some questions to Jihan and Sifiso for about an hour, and then we will open to you all. Meanwhile, I invite you to add questions in the chat box. Okay, so I would like to begin mentioning 2 recent controversies which involve the censorship of film archives. The first is related to the board of South Africa's Film and Publication Board, which recently ruled that Ousmane Sembène's seminal 1966 film Black Girl contained hate speech and was not fit for a screening during the Joburg Film Festival. A second and similar incident took place during the 15th edition of Documenta when an expert panel determined that an installation featured militant films of the Palestinian Revolution from the 1960s to the 1980s was anti-Semitic because Israel was portrayed in a one-sided negative way. So beyond these very reasons, the very reasons that were given to justify these acts of censorship, I was wondering why you think these or other film archives, for that matter, are so confronting and threatening in the current political moment. And maybe Jihan could get us started with the Documenta and Fair, and then we will move with Sifiso to hear more about the Joburg Festival. Jihan?
First of all, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for all the participants and friends to be there. It's a very heavy question to start off with, because it sounds like a simple thing, but it goes to the very root of where the problematics lie. And very ironically, I found myself right in the heart of both of them. The two problematics you mentioned. I'll let Sifiso talk more about the Film and Publication Board, but I think the one thing I want to say about the Black girl censorship is the fact that, first of all, it had passed the Film and Publication Board previously, so it's a new change. And it was shown in the festival after all, but mainly because the person who could challenge that instruction had the political clout to do so. And I mention that because that is what we're actually dealing with. Who has the clout to further agendas or not? And in terms of Documenta, I think Documenta is a very, very important moment, because it's a moment where I think ourselves as artists were terrorized into auto-censorship. And I think when we talk about the missing image, it's one thing for archive and missing images that we try always to find, to dig for, to piece together, but auto-censorship is a real threat. And when you have an entire nation, like what happened in Documenta, terrorizing anybody who touches on this theme, it's a very critical turning point. And for the moment, it's mainly Germany, and it's less so elsewhere, but nobody is raising their voice. And I think the raising the voice and just even asking the questions is really important. Now, allow me to frame this in terms of censorship. Now, we can call it censorship, but it goes beyond censorship. It really is about the decision of what narratives are to be allowed and what narratives are not allowed, because censorship can be a one-off here and there. You allow this and you don't allow that. It's about something specific. But when an entire narrative is excluded and punished, then it becomes much more problematic. And where we as artists and where we as filmmakers can insert ourselves in this equation is very important. And I'll take the opportunity to give a very simple example from one of the films I made. I made a film called The House of Saud in 2003. And it really was more about how did we get to 9/11? And in my film, I had 4 very separate sections. One about oil and security, one about modernity and Islam. Anyway, cut a long story short, and one of them was about Palestine and its role in all of this. And so I make the film comes out on the BBC, and then its American version, they call me up and they've taken out from the entire film the Palestinian strand. So it wasn't like there was a section called Palestine. It was a strand that was weaved into the whole film. And it was a big fat fight, because technically you're not allowed to do that. But when you look at the fine print, yes, they were allowed to do that. Now, where does resistance come in, and how do you resist when such dominant and powerful institutions decide to censor a narrative in all its full trajectory? So I didn't really have an option, but I did go through the fine print, and I found out that yes, they're allowed to have final count, they're allowed to this, the stuff that I hadn't read in the fine print. But nowhere in their fine print did they say that I was obliged to give them the handles that are necessary for editing a clip. So I told them, fine, do what you want with the film. So they chopped it all up. And once they chopped it all up, they came back and say, okay, we need the handles of the images to re-edit. I said, there's nowhere in the fine print that says you need it. Sorry, I'm not giving it. And this battle went on for 1.5 years. And they say, but you have to give it. And I say, no, you can't cut it and say no. So this battle, that space of that battle became on this grain of sand where you can actually stop the machine, okay? And finally they said, okay, after 1.5 years, they said, okay, let's talk. So, okay, let's talk. And I think that's the difference between the exclusion of an entire narrative and the ability to have a space to negotiate it, and censorship as such, whereas Black Girl and the film board just deciding no, out, is a different thing, is a censorship thing.
Thanks, Jihan. Sifiso, you want to jump in there?
Yes, for sure. Also want to say thank you, Omar, for having me here today. And I, thought the Film Publications Board in South Africa, I mean, the censorship of Black Girl was ludicrous. Ludicrous in two folds. And I think the one way speaks to, I guess, South Africa's general collective amnesia. Censorship was heavily instrumentalized by the apartheid regime to sort of, strengthen their ideologies. And they actually made martyrs of of people who sort of didn't really play that much of an active role in the liberation struggle because of things that they said towards the government and its rule. And so this becomes interesting in that, for one, these are people who obviously are in a space that they don't engage very much in, because if they did, they would know what Black Girl represents historically. But secondly, I mean, I think that they should be aware of, the space that they're in the sense that, censorship and banning orders, like I said, were sort of heavily instrumentalized by the apartheid government. They sort of like repeating the same mistakes that, I mean, it wasn't maybe necessarily mistakes then, but, the same sort of ways in which they dealt with arts that sort of liberated people during apartheid. And I think secondly, I said it's ludicrous because I also think that this was a way of maybe wanting to seem to be effective in what they're doing. It was performative for me more than anything else. It wasn't necessarily about the film, but it was about the moment. They're sending this message to South Africans to say that, look, one, we exist, and secondly, we are effective in what we're sort of mandated to do. I think for people who spend a lot of their time looking at a lot of Hollywood films that sort of making into South Africa's theatrical platforms, they always seem to be caught off guard when there's conversations about the proliferation of violence and maybe even pornography online. And so they'll hold think tanks and they'll talk about how they can improve on how they can control these images online. But I guess them trying to be effective in that space means that anything to them can easily sort of like pass off as offensive. Thank you. You're muted, Jihan.
Yeah, go ahead.
I jump in a bit with the Documenta, going back to subversive films and the films they showed, because I think it's really important. All the films were films from the 60s and 70s. And when this entire machine that literally honed on to just this one word, anti-Semitism, and we're starting to dig into what is anti-Semitic and what isn't. What was really interesting is that since they had already investigated subversive films, the question of funding, like they'd been investigating everyone for 3 months and couldn't find anything. And at some point they said, okay, for one of the films, and subversive films especially, had done something called the Tokyo Reels, which was the collection of it. And suddenly they wanted subversive films to condemn the Japanese Red Army. And Mohannad Yaqubi, who was putting together the collection, calls me and says, okay, we need to write something to condemn the Japanese Red Army. And I told him, are you out of your mind? The Japanese Red Army has been disbanded for God knows how many years. You're going to look like a total idiot condemning something that was disbanded 20 years ago today. Why? He says, because if we don't, then it means that we're anti-Semitic. So that connection, these connections of going back into history and trying to reinterpret history through the prism of today, I think is one of the transformations that we're living today that is the most dangerous. The wordings of what is now politically correct or incorrect. And so there are certain words in the lexicon of what used to be said in the 60s and 70s that suddenly people want to change in the films of the archive. But then how are you going to understand that space of the 60s and 70s if you transform it through the prism of today? And so I just thought that the idea of censorship goes beyond the narrative, beyond the actual stopping, but also in the use of wording and how that would, because in my work, one of the things I'm starting to look at is thinking of the archives of the future. And so we keep looking at the archives backwards, but looking at the archives forwards is as important. And if we start using these politically correct formulas and applying them to a past that did not have these formulas, I think that's another way of transforming our own histories.
Mm-hmm. So what is it in those, so beyond the very politics of those two very distinct acts of censorship and events, whether the Joburg or the Documenta, what is it about these film archives? Maybe Sifiso, you can talk about the film Black Girl and what that film actually represents for African cinema and what that act of censorship implies. And maybe Jihan, you can also talk a little bit about those militant films and what is it, why are those films important? Why are those archives important?
Okay, so Sifiso, maybe you would want to share the link, the Variety link I sent you for the group, because the contextualization of Black Girl in that article is quite interesting.
Okay, I'm going to scroll to find, oh, okay, here it is. But just in answering your question, Omar, I think for me as a filmmaker, I mean, this is one of the sort of earliest examples of African cinema where, you feel like, when you're watching it, you feel like we have complete agency, where you feel like we could completely control the narratives. And in my work, I look at both newsreel archives and cinema archives, and I often talk about, the level of participation that, Africans sort of engaged in creating work. And I think there's a period just before that, and especially in South Africa, that deals a lot with what I often refer to as it was a period of like identity formation, where it was very aspirational, but it was sort of controlled by white institutions, white money. So, a lot of performance films And you can see from the images that, the misrally, it's quite misrally, that's the word that I was looking for, that, it's not by people who are fully in control of the content that they're creating or that is created. And you often see this in the credits as well. So you get to Black Girl, and I think you get to a period that is, profound for African cinema, because I think for the first time you can see us on our own terms, basically creating a narrative that we own. And I think that throughout his profession, Ousmane Sembène was excellent at this, and so for me, this, this is why this film is important to me. And again, going back to the censorship, for me, I spoke about collective amnesia, but it also speaks to just how little we know, especially as South Africans, about our own history and histories of representations specifically. Because what you find is that we have the 1994 moment, right, which for me actually did a lot of erasure. I wanted to talk about erasure as well earlier on, in that Jihan, you talk about the vocabulary as well. The struggle during apartheid dealt with extremes. We sort of knew who the enemy was. We had a vocabulary for our own oppression, what it meant for us. And I think that when a moment comes to where people that says, okay, you're going to forget everything that you've known, you're going to forgive each other, and we're going to start on this new path. And this new path offers, it did offer quite a few opportunities, but a lot of danger in forgetting, which I think that South Africans are very good at collectively. It's very hard now to speak explicitly about our oppression, and I think this is maybe why it was so opportunistic for the Film and Publications Board to ban this film, because it sort of seems to discriminate against white people. But how do we then do we use the archive and talk about our history, to criticize, sort of like the status quo as it is now, because a lot of things have been, a lot of institutions are untransformed. So how do we then speak about that if the archive itself, for example, speaks about, or is riddled with Black victimhood? So it's for me, Jihan, it also sort of takes a lot of work going forward, speaking about the future archive, in that we have the opportunity in the present to make these transformations in the archive and repurpose them for something different, where we do find spaces where we can talk about how the past has shaped the present.
I'd like to jump in on Black Girl again, just a little bit, because I think that incident was extremely telling on many levels. And you'll allow me, Sifiso, I mean, I lived in South Africa for a long time, and I've made a film in South Africa, so that disconnect for me was quite flagrant, because obviously they had no idea what Black Girl represented for the rest of the continent. And at the same time, the South African desire to be some kind of role model or lead in the African image making, in leading Africa in many ways, and that disconnect between South Africa and the rest of the continent was flagrant with the issue of Black Girl. Because what was Black Girl? Black Girl was absolutely, comes out in 1966. This is 3 years after the independence of Algeria, and it's in Cannes. And despite the touchiness, despite all of it, it's in Cannes. And it's the very first ever film where the point of view of the camera and the narrative from beginning to end is from the perspective and the vantage point of the African lady. And so it's a seminal film in the transformation of the point of view in cinema. So just cinematically speaking, and blocking it is not just about watching the film. How do you teach it at universities? What are film students in South Africa going to learn as the first moment of this transformation, and done very elegantly through a very cinematic format? If you ban such a film, so it was a really, really colossal moment of understanding the disconnect on the continent. But these disconnects exist within regions, and that's why the whole process of decolonizing the archive, I absolutely hate the word decolonizing because it means strictly nothing at the point that we're speaking. Everybody has adopted the word decolonization as the fun word to use, but to really reassess the colonial archives, these sections, West Africa and its reality, and the laws that were imposed on it at the time, as opposed to, you know, the south of the continent, as opposed to South Africa, as opposed to the east of the continent. Each one has its own reality, its own laws, its own implementation. Now, for the archive, how do we as people trying to piece together just a very simple thing? I mean, I just feel sometimes I just turned 60 and like I spent the past 40 years of my life trying to piece together something that should have been an introduction to some book. You know, just piecing it together. I want to know what happened. I want to know what was happening at this place at that time. And you're just finding the pieces of the puzzle is very difficult. Now, if we add on top of it that we start banning from our own side these pieces of the puzzle to become part of our own conversation, and we see this happening for reasons, for military reasons, for now Islam, or whatever you want to call it, Islamic jihadi, terrorist, Islamophobia / whatever. We need to look at these things, examine them, understand where they came from.
Yeah, thanks for that. I would maybe like to bring this down to your own work and see what has, I mean, very often archives are taken as faithful testimonies of the past. And I was wondering if you could share some of your experience while working with colonial and liberation archives to make your film. So maybe Sifiso, you've made this wonderful film called Uprise, where you go through the where you've used apartheid material, and I was wondering, what did it take for you to go through that material, to encounter that material, to search that material, and to critically engage with it, and maybe share with us a little bit about what that film was about, and you know, and your grappling with the archive.
Yes, thank you. So there's the film Uprise is about, you know, the student uprising of 1976. We started in Soweto and spread to other parts of the country. And I mean, what sparked the uprising was the decree that, you know, all public schools in Black Township will use Afrikaans as a language of instruction. So, you know, the student resisted this, but they used the decree for a broader struggle, right? It was more of a liberation struggle because there are other demands that they started coming in. And, you know, we see sort of similarities between the 1976 student uprising and, you know, the struggles, for example, of Peace Must Fall and Rose Must Fall, which happened around 2014, 2015. But going back to Uprise, this is, you know, a film that I produced, that I directed, that I wrote and directed, and did the archive for. And I think that, you know, there's something very interesting about South Africa in that, you know, we find sort of little pockets for commemoration. And you usually have like days, you know, there's Youth Day on June 16, when, you know, people wear school uniform to, I guess, celebrate the youth of 1976 who, waged a liberation struggle against a monolithic government or oppressive government. So it just feels like the conversations generally doesn't go outside of those commemoration pockets, like those special day for shelter, which became Human Rights Day, and so for me it was a film that was it was a topic that was widely spoken about, but what I wanted to do was present the history differently. But also, in speaking about hegemonies, what we've seen from the ruling party in South Africa is co-opting other people's struggles or maybe narratives and owning them to form part of the agenda. And so what was clear to me, which I think was vague to a lot of people, and what became clear to me in my research, is how much of the struggle was the struggle of the Black consciousness movement, and not sort of a nebulous Black liberation struggle. It's not part of the ANC, it's not part of the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, but specifically, you sort of emerges from the Black consciousness movement. So that was the one thing. I think that was kind of like a very important narrative for me to run throughout the film, to remind people that, where the struggle was coming from. Because again, we're very good at forgetting. But secondly, I think a lot of the archives that I've come across, and was sort of, there was a lot of violence on the Black body, and you sort of get in there and you understand that, these archives or these images had a particular function at a particular time. I think the 70s is when the conversations around boycotting the South African companies or doing business with South Africa, and people talking of divestments was happening during this time. And I think maybe to some degree it was important to show how bad it was, to show the brutality. But what we're left with in the archive is, a string of Black bodies lying on the ground, nameless. All you see is faces. And I think that there was also a lot of conversation about apartheid fatigue. People saying, people who should be concerned about, apartheid and its effects on current South Africa were saying, that young people especially, we have apartheid fatigue. We keep seeing these films about apartheid, and we are trying to move on. So, this kind of poses a challenge in how do you make work that is different, that asks different questions, that is interesting, but also presents maybe a different and fresh archive. And so that was the challenge for me, in that I was looking for images that had, minimal, Black victimhood, or images of Black people dying, and, sort of like abject violence on the Black body. And so that was the first step for me, was just to, in telling stories about apartheid, how do we then start to do things differently? How do we look at apartheid archives differently? Because you will see a lot of violence and you will see a lot of defeat. But those moments where, the students are fighting back, or people are raising their fists, the Black power salute, fist in the air moments, it was really just playing with those kind of images to sort of show sort of the more, more affirming moments of our struggle. So I think that was the first thing that I looked at when working with archives on Uprise.
Yeah, Jihan, in your film Nasser, Egypt's Modern Pharaohs, you also deal with an ingent quantity of archives, and these are like national. They are conceived under the header of National Liberation Archives. So what does it mean to work with those archives for you? And what is the process in which you take this archive and you sort of demystify these liberation narratives, you go behind it and sort of you reappropriate that? And Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's saying a bit too much to say it was National Archive, because I literally had to gather this from the photographers who were there, the kids that were there, stuff that, so it really was archaeology more than access to the National Archive, because you do not get access to the National Archive categorically. So, I mean, and I think that's something we'll probably talk about later, because the erasures that Sifiso was talking about are not just about the erasures of memory, they're also our own erasures. They're also our government desires to, I remember Sifiso was working with me on the film we did on the ANC. And one of the things we were discussing this when I was in South Africa last week, that I kept trying to figure out, what is it that is blocking the system? And one of my answers, which I have seen repeatedly while doing my other films, is that every liberation movement, every new government, every national body that comes to power needs to create its own mythology. And its mythology is very much based on the archive. So the purifying the archive, transforming the archive, using out of context the archive are all part of constructing the future too. And I think that's really important. So in my Nasser film, I remember when I started looking for images, it suddenly struck me, was there no moment of the life of this man when he was standing without an entire population cheering for him? It's like there is not an image of Nasser where people are not, yes, Zahim, you know, and like, is there no other context where we can see Nasser? And it took a lot of hard work to find a representation of Nasser that doesn't look like that isn't the hero. So just the everyday life. And of course, I had been doing a lot of research, so I knew what was happening at the same time as these images. So it's really how and that's where the role of filmmakers and image workers in all their formats, be it even as VR, as artists, as whatever, our role is fundamental, because the only indication of an alternative representation usually comes from the art world or the film world. Either like usually just after that person dies. And so in the case of Nasser, the minute I said I want to look for images of Nasser to the TV, like the archive in Egypt technically was deposited in 4 different spaces. So it took me about 2 years to just get the logs. And I like getting the logs was the biggest achievement of all time, because at least I knew what was filmed and what was not filmed. Now, finding the images of the logs is a completely different matter, of course. Okay, now you go back to these 4 spaces, and half of the archives have been sold. Saudi Arabia bought the entire archive of Hayat al-Ista'lamat for $1 million. So you have entire films, entire loads of, and we're talking in the 90s. And so I said, okay, maybe you will find them in the Ministry of Information. Well, Ministry of Information, turns out that the guy who ran the archives used to sell them. So I ended up going to private collectors, and the private collector, somebody was just interested in this aspect, and they'd say, oh, but my competition guy is interested in this. So it really is how do you, it's like a piece of a puzzle, putting together a piece of a puzzle. And the minute I said the word Nasser, it was like, what are you going to say about him? It's like, I don't know, I'm researching. So how do I know in advance what I'm going to say? So there's a jealousy about how you then transmit history, which I myself indulged in, as Sifiso knows. I had a big issue when I was doing my South Africa film of how to deal with Mandela, whom I had interviewed, but who, according to my research and according to everything that was in the film, a big issue of what happened later was Mandela's absence, Mandela not willing to intervene in getting some feuds sorted. And so my decision was to exclude Mandela from my film, because that was the only way I could talk about an icon without breaking it. Because I don't want to be the person who starts breaking an icon and it's going to live there forever. No, I can't do that, especially that on our continent, we need icons. We don't have that many. So it's important to find languages to try and at least leave the crumbs for future generations to follow. And it would be easier in the future for them to look into the past. And that's what I think our work, Sifiso and I, is about. We can come in the 2000s and look in 76 and break it down and ask questions that people would not be able to ask at the time. And so part of our duty as archive researchers and archive practitioners is also to leave crumbs of things that a trail of crumbs of things that we cannot deal with right now.
I don't know if I can add to that, Omar.
Yes, you can.
I think what is very interesting and special about South Africa is that, when we often think about the archive, we usually, think about, images, films, or even, document texts. But we don't necessarily think about, architecture, for example, or spatial planning, how cities are designed, for example. And South Africa is interesting in the sense that, the apartheid spatial planning is still very much intact. You have the economic centers, which are the cities, and just outside of that, you have the suburbs, and not too far, you have what we call townships, which sort of functioned as labor reserves, where the majority of Black people who could be close to the city or work in the city could, live, come into the city, work, and then leave in the evening. They used to have curfews. And so that sort of apartheid spatial design hasn't been transformed at all. So it means that even the economic flow, how money flows in South Africa, is still the same. And people now talk a lot about economic liberation, which is very interesting, because what it means is that as much as you can take people who are sort of, were called, referred to as formerly oppressed, into these new spaces that cannot take everyone. So the erasure works so effectively that even with all this evidence around you, that is apartheid spatial planning, there's still not an urgency to sort of like transform our society. And this is, I find it interesting because it always feels like there's going to be a revolution in South Africa. It always feels like it's not far. You think to yourself, the way things are going, the rich and poor divide, and how bad it's getting, that at any given moment, people will take to the streets, and there won't be any looking back, and we're going to see a revolution. But for some reason, it never comes, because I think that the narratives that are created around democracy, the ideas of democracy and freedom, are so strong that, the ideas of social cohesion, of unity are still very much strong today. So the 1994 project in South Africa still is still very strong. I went into this, Jihan, because I was reminded of this when you spoke about Nelson Mandela, in that you talk about his absence, or the deliberate absence, in your film. And when we talk about archive, especially South African Liberation Archive, this is someone who, with your eyes closed, you can pick any clip. You can go to Reuters library and just click on a couple of clips, and you're bound to see Mandela. So this is someone who's documented very well. So, outside of the newsreel archives, you have documentaries there are many documentaries that were made about him. You have the concerts that were made about him or in his honor that are documented. So it's also very hard for archive practitioners who want to create alternative narratives or want to focus on specific figures who are not so well documented. And you see that it is the same. The archive almost reflects the hegemonic narrative that the ANC was so well invested in pushing out, and that it becomes very hard to tell the apartheid story without mentioning Mandela or without showing Mandela. It almost feels like, something's missing. How can you talk? I mean, this was a struggle that was largely waged by the people beyond what the liberation movements were doing. But if you were to tell that film, it's almost, I think, to a lot of outsiders, it would seem as though you, I don't know, maybe missed the point, or if you deliberately omit Mandela from the apartheid liberation narrative.
But that's
I just wanted to
apply this to FLN, apply this to Algeria, apply this to every single country, suddenly ends up with a single narrative and a single liberation movement, as though the others never existed.
Yeah, so the point, like Jihan, you were saying, is like, and I found that really interesting, no? It's like, how do we leave those icons? Because we don't have so many, no? And the question is precisely, how do we find other icons, no? Because it's full of icons, which is done, haven't been able, because, particularly in colonial contexts where all the archives have been dismembered, destroyed, dispersed in the ways that you were saying, they are closed. So how do we go about finding those alternative histories that, still remain in the margins, whether there are figures that are, neglected, women or collectives or parties or unions, etc. And so how do we go about that?
I found one very recently that blew my mind away. I'm a big fan of music and especially electronic music. Not only, but also. And for everyone who knows anything about electronic music, the father of electronic music is Pierre Schaeffer, and his first album in 1948 and all of that. And then suddenly I discover that in 1944, sorry, there's something going on here. In 1944, an Egyptian called Halima Daba actually produced an electronic album that was out in 1944, 4 years earlier than Pierre Schaeffer. And I think the reason I say that is that it's not about they don't exist or they haven't done anything, but it is what value is given. So the fatherhood of anything major somehow by definition has to go to someone from the West. The fact that 4 years earlier, that exact same format and that exact same kind of genre of creation came out on almost on the same label is dismissible. So how do we, it's not just about how do we find these people, it's how do we give these people or these ideas or these collectives the space? How do we give them the space? Because it's not, the problem is not finding them. Right now, I'm here in Burkina Faso. We're working on a film with a young Senegalese guy about the commander of the northern region in Guinea-Bissau, the lady whose iconic photograph, she's carrying a gun with a shishya and carrying a baby at the same time. And everybody knows the picture, but nobody knows who this woman is. And he had to spend months and months until he found out the exact, so it's how do we give the space and give them their due, actually, not even construct a narrative. It's just how do we give people their due, and more importantly, how to collectivize that space. Because somehow we want one person to be responsible or one person to be the icon. But this woman in Guinea-Bissau, she's called Commander Titina Sila. Titila was one out of 20 women who went to the Soviet Union and then to Havana to go training and then came back. Now, everybody talks about this one woman because of that one picture. What happened to the other 19? Some of them are still alive. So how do we create that space? And I think in film, it's something we can do.
What's interesting about that image, sorry, Jihan, is that I don't know if you are aware, but it's it was circulating on social media for the longest time. I think maybe even close to about 18 months, where people were sharing it and saying that it was a woman whose name I forgot now, a South African woman who fought in the ANC's Umkhonto weSizwe, which is the liberation wing of the ANC. Name and surname. And, you know, for many months, a lot of people were, you know, commemorating and, you know, celebrating her and saying, let's not forget about, you know, women's participation in the struggle for liberation. And this is the person, this is one of the people that were, you know, that were sacrificed during the South African liberation struggle. And it was that very same image, and I know which image you're talking about.
That's where contextualizing images it's a huge chantier. How do you say chantier? It's still it's a field that we haven't even started, and I'm not even going to talk about indexing, because the number of things that you receive the images, and if you don't know the face of the person yourself, and the image says that's who it is, well, you take it for granted. The number of times I've come across an image is like, what do you mean it's that person? I know it's this other person. And if you don't have a reference or someone to go to and say, who is this person? And that's why when I say about archives of the future, there's so many people still alive who are sitting there, who have the keys to so much of this, and we're ignoring them. Because they're not bringing something interesting or sexy to the table. But what they have is the keys to a lot of what is still locked behind.
That's it's been a very interesting aspect to my work as archive researcher, because it means that even with clips that we've seen over and over again, for example, we see a clip or image of Nelson Mandela outside a courthouse, and he's surrounded by, you know, 8, 10 other people with him. And maybe, you know, 4 people who are foregrounded in that image, or 5. But then when you start to dig deeper and you see consistency in, say, the one person right at the back who's nameless, but who sort of tends to appear in several clips that you keep finding, and then all of a sudden, all these images that you kept seeing have this, you know, a character who, you know, somewhat, you know, central to, you know, to the liberation struggle, but just maybe not so much in, you know, centralized in the history of the liberation struggle. And it happens in that way. And I think that part of the role is to also have like a corrective approach to history. You see a lot of documentaries that speak about the ANC, for example, that will use images of the Pan-Africanist movement and during Sharpeville, you know, waging their struggle, which, you know, they sort of planned and executed on their own, and sort of created this moment, which would then be a turning point in our history that would also go to the United Nations and have them make certain policies with regards to human rights. But a lot of people that are Robert Sobukwe, who's
PAC,
who we're celebrating today because he died on this day. He's a lot of his archives were destroyed by the apartheid government. They were trying to completely destroy his voice. So you don't see a lot of him in the archive. There's his speeches, which there aren't many of, a couple of interviews and a couple of images. His voice and his moving image, almost, if not completely non-existent. So apart from the work of having to continuously excavating archives to find particular figures who sort of played an important role, it is also about what Jihan has mentioned, in that you have to sort of like correct certain things because the indexing is incorrect. Because the central, or what is deemed as important history in the moment of documentation, might be this one figure who happens to be in the front, but we sort of tend to forget everything that's happening in one single frame. There could be so many historical trajectories in one single frame. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily engage with that, but there's a responsibility, I think, for the archive researcher to ask as many questions as they can, but like every single frame they come across in the archives, say, what conditions produced this? Who are the people involved, and for what end? And who are the people who were involved? And that. And I think when you ask the deeper questions, sort of, the bigger plot starts to reveal itself, and you realize that there's a lot that sort of has now entered into the space of myth that might not be necessarily so. And I mean, I use that one image that you referred to earlier on. But there are other examples like that where you have a lot of images that have been sort of appropriated to represent something else.
At the risk of offending a lot of you academics sitting around, I'm going to take that risk anyway. I think the whole academic structure of footnoting and bibliography and referencing, because if it's not footnoted, bibliographized, and referenced, then it doesn't exist. That is one of the biggest blockages to alternative narratives, because when nothing has been written in a book that is published and has a reference number and the rest of it, then it doesn't exist. And I think of my Cuba film, Cuba's African Odyssey, as a good example of this, because it was by complete accident. I'd read everything written about it. I'd done like my homework proper, and everything was saying the same narrative. And I find one piece of paper that says something that just doesn't make sense. How can this have happened at the same time as that? So I start following it, and I get to the point where I'm not going to get into the details, but I go to the guy who used to run the African department in the KGB, and I'm asking him about Che in the Congo and the rest of it. And after a moment of silence, he eventually says, well, we didn't know. I was like, what do you mean you didn't know? He said, we didn't know that Che was in the Congo. It's like, but all your arms and weapons were there. Like, what do you mean you didn't know? He says, okay, we found out in 1996 on this date because that's what happened. We did not know. And suddenly you have an entire alternative narrative that you need to research from A to Z, and not a scrap of it exists in writing. So you have to chase the people who are alive, and suddenly you realize, like, damn, like everybody, there's this other part of history has it happened that existed, and everybody confirms the where and the how and the when, but nobody has ever written it. So do you just cancel this just because it's not footnoted and has a bibliography? And again, that's why I keep coming as though I'm making the promotion of film, which I am, I guess. But film is a space where you can do that. You can have a first-hand eyewitness who talks to you and tells you a part of history that has not been documented. And that alternative narrative is what we shy away from. And I think we have an obligation to start looking at it in these critical times.
I mean, I wish that people in the university would actually footnote and bibliographize everything that should be footnoted, but unfortunately we don't. I think part of this project aim is precisely to really center those stories in the margin and oral histories and public histories, no? So that is what is central to a lot of the work that we're trying to do. But I wanted to go back to the issue of archaeology, and maybe you can share for us who, you know, I suppose many that do not work with audiovisual material, what does it mean? I know that Jihan has been doing films using archived material when nobody was doing documentary film doing that, and what it meant, and what is the state of the infrastructure, where does then, you know, go, what do you find today in terms of accessing those films, the problems that, you know, Sifiso was also mentioning in terms of indexing, but also in terms of copyrights. What does it mean to look at material that, you know, you need to pay excessive amounts of money for just getting a little peek, and how that, you know, makes really complicated to tell any story through images. I don't know, maybe Sifiso, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think the biggest barrier for me right now, and for a lot of filmmakers, is you know, with regards to access, is price. A lot of these archives, especially South African archives, you know, owned by foreign agencies. So, you know, the people who are doing a lot of the documenting, maybe say the BBC, South Africa didn't have a public broadcaster until television broadcaster until January 1976. So everything up until then was documented by mainly, say, Reuters, ITN, and the BBC. And I think that for a lot of filmmakers who, you know, emerging filmmakers who want to take on historical films or even political films, you know, price is a big barrier for them. And also some of the things that we sort of mentioned earlier on, that with the indexing being incorrect, it means that, you know, for a lot of filmmakers or writers, we continuously see the same sort of material on screen, because a lot of these, you know, clips that are sort of, there's a lot of laziness as well. So, you know, a lot of these agencies will present you the same clips. If you give them a theme and say, these are the, you know, this is the topics, or you know, the subjects of the film, and generally they'll give you the things that are quite familiar. And so you, I guess, have the responsibility to dig in deeper. And I think for a lot of people also just understanding the archive landscapes, the landscape from a rights point of view. What does it mean to use something commercially? What does it mean to use something for educational purposes? What is it that you can get away with? You know, what is fair use? What counts as fair use? And I think that, you know, these sort of policies that are sort of drawn around copyrights around the archives and really, you know, sort of like communicated clearly and to, you know, to a lot of researchers who work with the archive. The other thing is also, you know, the materiality of the archive. You know, you do find stuff that's shot really well, and it maybe depends on who shot that material and for what use. So you might find that working with colonial archives, Someone like me, for example, who will find, say, you know, the BBC's African reels. A lot of them, you know, would look, they shot on 35 mil, they look great. And you might find one or two archives that fall outside of that, outside of the ethnographic, that aren't as polished, that, you know, are hardly usable. And you have to think about how you, but that are special in content. And you have to think about how, you know, how to incorporate those archives in the film.
Jihan, you also wanted to invite you to talk, but also to mention perhaps something about that manifesto that circulated some time ago called the Liberate the Image, I mean, a manifesto to restitute collective memory. And, you know, what is it that can be done in order to, you know, get back those archives that belong to the people of the South and that now are behind paywalls?
I think we're at a very interesting juncture, because we're at a period where talking archive is part of the mainstream. You're not just battling to say, oh, archive is important. People have recognized the importance of archive. So that adds a new nuance to it, which is careful, because even the idea of conservation and preservation, which is very important, but then the question is, who decides what we preserve and what we conserve? And why do we have to conserve and preserve everything? So all these are questions that are starting to be put on the table. Now, Liberate the Image manifesto came from a series of archive workshops that we started ages ago, and I'm part of several groupings. Most of us have been working with the archive for more than 20 to 25 years. So all of us were the ugly ducklings who had to twist the channel's arm to say the technical specs, because one of the issues of the archive is broadcasting had technical specs. And so if your archive didn't meet the technical spec, they couldn't broadcast the film. So we had to come up with all these ways and means to meet the technical specs or convince them to lower them. So there was a group, starting with the Black Audio Collective in London, in the 80s. So I've worked with John, with Kojo, with June Giovanni, Keith Sheary, all these people. We were like Amazons of the archive at the time, and nobody wanted to listen to us. Now, how this has changed, it has also entered the factor of be careful, it's becoming too popular. What is it we want out of it, I think is very key. Now, today, there are a lot of foundations, a lot of institutions that are throwing money into the conservation and preservation. We're not saying no. Hallelujah, thank God. But that is not the only item. How do we distinguish what is what? We did the mass of what needs to be done. How do we continue and gather people to work in the same direction than rather have these, what Edward Said used to call dukkanet, meaning little shops? How do we all work in the same direction to make this happen? Because if each one has his own little fund to do his own little thing, these will never connect or reconnect. So I think that's also part of our mission. Now, the complexity, I might have kind of lost the thread of what you were asking me, but I do think that we're at a critical moment, and Liberate the Image was about liberating the image. What does this image say? How do we appropriate it? To be perfectly honest, more and more nowadays, most of the colonial archives, I take out the sound. I don't want to know what they're saying. I'm going to appropriate this image because I know where it's happening. I know what time it was. I probably know what the context is, and I'm not going to let you tell me what this is. And we're going to appropriate it. We'll look at people, and I don't care. Because it's part of our reconstruction of a narrative. If I have to listen to another Belgian saying how long the nose is for you to be a Hutu or a Tutsi, we're going to be engaged in that narrative forever. Sorry, bye-bye, rawah. Sorry. Anyway, don't we want to open this to...
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say it's something in closing, Jihan, that connects to what you're saying now. And I guess it speaks to, the future of archives. And I guess the sort of like, I don't know, the sort of agency we can take in dealing with archives, right? And I've seen a lot more interesting conversations around how we can appropriate violence archives of, say, colonialism, maybe slavery, and even apartheid. And, you spoke about John earlier on, and I'm assuming that you're speaking about John Akompra, who sort of came up with the philosophy of montage. And he says that, by taking, one or two or more sort of archive images, you start to create something that sort of speaks differently to the imagination. And I think that we need to sort of allow ourselves to create new myths about who we are using the very archives, and I think that, it's the same conversation. I think the American filmmaker and visual artist, Arthur Jafa, has something that he's sort of termed black visual intonation. And it's usually just like a collection of archives and, creating little pieces, which are usually very provocative, but they sort of somehow, are taken out of their original context to create something new about Black people, mainly in the United States, and the extension of this is also seen in Saidiya Hartman's work, who comes with, what she terms critical fabulations. And in her work, she usually takes a lot of, sort of like smaller characters, especially Black or historical characters. And it's usually Black women that she takes out of stories and sort of, broadens the history around that one figure. And so it becomes interesting in the way that, you can use archive in sort of, creating either a larger body of work or, a sort of like a whole recreation of the identity of the archive. And I think for me, where the conversation should converge is on access, what we are allowed and not allowed to do. And I think we spoke briefly about it. What do we give ourselves permission to appropriate and, and sort of like reinterpret into something else, because there are these boundaries when it comes to access with archives.
Thank you, Sifiso. Thank you, Jihan. Those are great insights, and I hope that we get some questions. So I would like to open to anybody, and please maybe turn on your camera and ask the question. I already see Noor with a question, so go ahead, Noor.
Thanks very much, Omar. And a special thanks to Sifiso and Jihan. That was just fantastic, listening to the two of you having very insightful and reflective conversations. I agree with almost everything that you've said. I do have a slight disagreement on footnotes, which I'll come to in a second. Inevitably, right? You would have expected the bunch here to have some disagreement with you on that, if nothing else. I have a question about the future and your role as film producers, filmmakers, producers of history, in fact. And I wonder how you perceive your role in the making of archives. I think we've had a wonderful kind of critique of the problems that one faces across the continent and elsewhere, but particularly on our continent, in relation to the existing archives, which have largely been produced, at least in the case of South Africa, by the colonial and apartheid regimes. So that's the archive one is working with. I mean, circumstances differ across the world, but in South Africa, the problem, one of the big problems we have with the archive at the moment is that the democratic government is not particularly keen on archives. If you compare the archival kind of mission to that of the apartheid government, it's quite amazing just how different it is and how little attention has been given. And in fact, the archive is probably in crisis. So the question really to both of you is, what role, potentially also responsibility, do you see yourselves having in the creation of new archives, rather than only kind of excavating, albeit in very critical ways, existing archives? What about your work do you imagine to be not only about interpretation, or, artistic production and creativity, but also archiving? To what extent is archiving central in your own practices, in the way that you go about doing your work? And then, so that's the question. I just want to say, Jihan, I think that that footnotes are precisely what you say. They're the crumbs that lead people to the sources, and therefore I think they're indispensable. Thanks.
Are there any other questions? And we can take maybe another question to, I see, Jihan. Yes.
Yes, hello, Jihan. Hello, everybody. I would like to go on the manipulation or the practice of the archives and the difference between the practice or the manipulation of the archives with the filmmakers that you are, and you have given us a wonderful expose of your experience with the archives. And when Jihan, Tahri, you say that you cut the sound because the sound it doesn't interest you, and you reappropriate the archives. And I think here is a slight difference between a historian who will take the archive or the visual archives with all the elements that are in the archives in terms to analyze it and to write it. So I want to reflect with you on this practice of the archives, and the practice of the archives with each discipline, and if we are now mixing all this discipline and working to a future where filmmakers became historian maybe become filmmakers, and to take off all the boundaries that exist between those two words, between arts and science. Thank you again.
Okay, so I think we lost.
I'm back.
And she's back.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
I'm back on my phone, so I don't know how this works exactly, but well, voila.
Okay, it's working for now. We had a question, Jihan Sphere. You might want to ask that question again in brief, because Jihan was missing, if you don't mind.
Yes, it was about the manipulation and the apprehension of the archives between the artist and the historian, scientist, sociologist, etc. And when you said that you cut off the sound of the movie, of the film of archive that you hear, I had, as a historian, even if it's been said already about the narratives, etc. The sound is very interesting for a historian.
Absolutely.
And I was asking the question for the future, because you talked about the future. If the boundaries between arts and science, between historians and between filmmakers is going to disappear, and historians will become filmmakers and filmmakers will become historians, could it be like that? Could we like just blow the methodology?
Yeah, I think it's already the case. Some historians are, I don't know why this is doing this, but never mind. I think historians are, lots of them are filmmakers and vice versa. And this whole wanting to peg people in one specific corner is disappearing. It's disappearing with the technology, it's disappearing with the multidiscipline. But let me go backwards and say that the space I'm coming from is that every time you touch an archive and use it in any format, you yourself are creating a new archive. So once you are doing that, the question for me is, what is it now that you are creating a new archive based on the old? Based on a reflection or a critique or a going along with or whatever you choose. But the minute you touch it and put it in a different context, in a different time, for a different audience, then you're creating something new. So I do believe that the role of the artist, the filmmaker, is absolutely fundamental in the collective memory of something. Now, the sound, of course, even at least out of curiosity, you're going to listen to it. But allowing it to be the sacredness of the archive, which is a phase I went through, I won't deny it. My first phase early on when I was looking for archive was a phase of archaeology and sacredness. You find a piece of footage and you think that you've added to the history of the world something that had been lost forever. But then you get to the point where you tell yourself, well, hold on a minute. Why was this bit filmed that day and not what was happening next door? And so Sifiso talks about Saidiya Hartman, and everybody refers to Saidiya Hartman about critical fabulations. Now, I find it as interesting, her concept of silencing the image, not just the missing image, the silencing of images. So our government choice to send out a film crew to film this event rather than the demonstration that was actually happening means that in the archive, what is it you're going to find? You're going to find the event and not the demonstration. So I think that bridge between the different disciplines and how we can piece together an idea, part of it is about appropriation. And as an artist and as a filmmaker, I have the space for individual appropriation. I am not claiming that I'm a historian. And that's where it's good. Because a historian has a sacredness also. So I guess I'm coming a bit out of the space of we need to desacralize all of this in order to interpret it, in order to wrap our heads around it. We haven't even gotten that far.
Sifiso, you want to go?
Sorry, just to add a little bit, and I think, Jihan, you sort of dealt with this notion well in saying that you're not interested in, how long the nose is or short it is to make you a Tutsi or a Hutu from, from a Belgian. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of dealing with the archive. And I mentioned this in the beginning to say that there's a lot of violence in the archive. The violence that sort of like speaks to who you are, the person who's faced with it. And I think that for a lot of archive researchers, we sort of like get into the space where we have to deal with what's called, salvage ethnography, because part of the responsibility of our work is to change the narrative, because we know how, our histories have been denigrated, how it's been reduced. And so how do you present a new narrative using a visual language? And this is where, you know, archives can come in. And I think, sorry, this also speaks to Noor's question about the work that we're doing now as filmmakers, and how are we sort of archiving the moment. And I think that, you know, you can use the past to sort of give context or critique the present. And what's left out of that is obviously, you know, an archive for future generations to tap into, to say that, you know, one archive exists, let's say, you know, in colonial or apartheid archives that has a very specific narratives about who people are. But, you know, as filmmakers today, we have, I guess, that opportunity to then tell, you know, the different narratives. And what I referred to it and do what I referred to earlier on is like a corrective approach to history, in that you now have the tools to create counter-hegemonic narratives.
Thanks. Marcelito, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I feel like a lot of my questions were already kind of addressed in the discussion, but
Marcelito?
most, or some of the things that stood out was the colonial archives, and Sifiso maybe could kind of touch on how one is historically, you know, used to. Yes, can you hear?
Yeah.
Hi.
No, yeah, you completely went metal voice. So if you can repose your question, that'd be lovely.
Okay. My question is around the agency of people that were captured in colonial archives or colonial film archives, and I'm curious about how a filmmaker and an archival practitioner encounters that with a medium that was historically used to kind of oppress in a way and observe from a particular lens. And I was wondering if both Jihan and Sifiso could speak a little bit about, you know, how they encounter that in the archives that they've worked with. And then just finally, a quick one is around, you know, the iconic and these figures that have become central to liberation struggles. And you mentioned Mandela in the discussion, and I wonder how then, you know, in addition to appropriating the archive in various ways, do you propose one can speak about these historical victories or losses without, you know, making too much of an explicit use, I suppose, of, you know, images of violence or images of these really iconic moments? I think, yeah, essentially what I'm asking is, how do you incorporate the everyday in your process of engaging with the archive and you know, making films? Thanks.
Thank you, Marcelito. Jihan has another panel coming up, so she will have to leave very shortly. So maybe Jihan, you can respond first. Okay, Sifiso, maybe you want to go and give. Yeah.
All right. So on the idea of agency, and I mean,
Sorry, can you hear me?
we can hear you now, Jihan. Please go ahead.
Sorry, this is turning into a nightmare. But can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Let me just very briefly say about the incorporating daily life. I think daily, Sifiso mentioned architecture as an element. I think it's a very important thing to remember, because our spatiality is something that is very ignored. And I think in film, you manage to capture space, architecture, and all these are hints that will be interpreted in the future. I think it's very dangerous to think that what we are doing today, we're thinking of it today as archive. But archiving the future is about being conscious that what it is we leave behind needs to be contextualized, needs to be indexed, needs to be to know who's in these images, what it is. So I think it adds an additional obligation onto those who make images, especially at a time where we are flooded with images. Don't forget TikTok. TikTok could become our narrative. And we know, and selfies. And we know today, because we're living it, that the image we portray of ourselves, our desire for alternative representation, has become the mass of the images that exist. So it's how do we deal with, and in every era, it's the same. How do we deal with the images of the 60s when we know that in the 60s, the cameras, you didn't have beta cams yet. Every time you send a camera out, it's a 35mm. So just to get the stock for it and to send a camera out has its implications on the image. Then you get into VHS and beta. So the mobility of the image creates a different aspect. And now each one of us has a phone, and what that means and how we create these images do affect the future. So I think contextualizing all of this in our daily life is really important. And on this note, I would say thank you very much. And I accept the critique of the footnote, even if I didn't hear it, but I still want to contest it. Thank you very much, Omar. Thank you, Sifiso. Thank you, everybody there. And sorry, I have to jump off board for a minute. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jihan.
Sifiso.
Yeah, so on the question of agency, this is something that I've started sort of like consciously engaging because I realized that there's limitations to, to how, Native, or in my context, Black South Africans participated in the creation of these archives. And I think what is clear when you spend time with a lot of archives is that both in, the sort of film cinema space, and again, in sort of like the documentary or even newsreel space, is that the archives are the same depending on, or largely the same depending on the period that they were made and the outcomes or what they were created for. So you will move from, a lot of sort of like ethnographic film in the turn of the century, where, we literally sort of portrayed as savages. So if there is a narrative, it will be about, the savagehood of the people that you're seeing on screen. And it sort of moves, right? It changes to a point where you see a little bit more Black participation. But like I said earlier on, this Black participation is minstrelly. It's sort of still kind of like reductionist because it doesn't talk about the conditions of the people. So if you go into the 50s, in South African archives, both, it is more about, the identity formations of the time, what people were listening to, sort of like what they were addressing, their interest in sport and boxing. And you find this sort of across the board, this is the archives that you'll see if you sort of like look at the South African cinema from that time, late 40s, 50s, you'll see Zonk, you'll see African Gym. These are largely sort of like films that were largely produced by white filmmakers who saw an opportunity to tell Black stories for Black audiences. But, they say nothing about the conditions of the people on screen. So you realize that every era that you deal with, there is something that happens. There's a sort of like a magic that happens where if you spend enough time, the subjects in those in those archives, there are moments where they sort of kind of speak back, you know, and it could be just a brief moment where they look straight into camera. And what that moment says to you is, a lot of the time, is that, you know, with everything that's happening here, there's a level of discomfort with being captured on screen. And you realize that, you know, maybe there may have been limits to their participation. And I think that I engage with this consciously because in my extracting some of the images and creating a new narrative from them, there's a responsibility, because it says that these are, you know, people who weren't entirely in control in the making of these images, or who weren't entirely free, you know. And I mean, we can even go deeper and maybe question, you know, how much they were paid and that sort of thing, and how, you know, sort of how that speaks to their agency. And I think that part of the responsibility in talking about representation is how, as a filmmaker, in your narratives, how you can be more affirming of those identities, or, you know, how you can affirm those identities a bit more. And I spoke a little bit earlier about what's referred to as salvage ethnography, you know. And I think there needs to be a level of awareness and cognizance and responsibility that speaks directly towards issues of representation. And I think Jihan touched it on the nose when she said that we're no longer interested in how big your nose has to be. Yes, maybe because we also realize that that kind of history has been documented, and we've been having those conversations over and over again. But how do we create counter narratives, or, you know, narratives that are counter hegemonic? And I think that's where the responsibility comes in, and maybe the distinction also comes in between, say, an artist who's a filmmaker and a historian, is that it's, you know, questions around agency and, you know, what needs to be preserved and what doesn't, and what needs to be remixed comes into play. And this is something that's also sort of taken a lot of preoccupation in my work, in that I recently, maybe not so recently, but about 3-4 years ago, I made a music video for an artist made completely out of colonial archives and apartheid archives, where, you know, a lot of them were made sort of like denigrate African history and, you know, African people. And the exercise for me was about how to create, I'll see if I can find a link and post it in the chat box for the video, but how it was an experiment in creating something completely new that sort of is taken completely off or outside of that context and has a new meaning. I don't know if that answers your question sufficiently.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Somebody else has questions you would like to ask? I actually, if nobody asks, I had another question for you, Sifiso, that I wanted to ask you both, actually, because I know that Jihan as well, on her project on people's stories, she's been trying to think about what it means to work with image, but also how to go beyond image. And I know that you, in your work, as well as you were saying, you've been working with music, and I wonder how that, you know, contributes to reappropriate the image, working with sound and with music, and if there is there. And also, if you know, you can say something more about your latest project, latest film, feature film.
Okay, all right. So yeah, I think what's interesting also is, you know, I think music generally adds like a completely different reading of the aesthetics of a film. And what I found in my work also is that, you know, when it comes to sound in a film, it's generally very easier now, and I think it's the influence of classical music, to go towards sort of like, you know, strings, to sort of portray or maybe invoke the feeling of sort of like, the deeper emotions, nostalgia, longing, and that's, that kind of thing. And if you're dealing with danger, you'll bring in sort of like the percussive sound, the drum. So I think to some level, over time, certain sounds have gone on to represent specific kinds of feelings in cinema, and I find it very interesting when I see African films that have a lot of strings, for example, where you hear a lot of violins, or maybe even, hear a lot of like the piano. And I wonder about, that kind of sort of like, sonic representation of those moments, and whether or not the characters who are being portrayed in that moment and their feelings could be interpreted as what the film sort of is aiming to do. And I think the interesting thing for me about going into music is really trying to find or move closer to the authenticity of like the moments you see on screen with music, and what and what that feels like. I think that what's offered us with the films emerging out of West Africa in the 60s and 70s by Jibril Diop Mabeti and Ousmane Sembène, and maybe Suleiman Sisse, is that the authenticity of those moments were not necessarily just about like the characters, what they were saying, what they were critiquing, and sort of like the messaging of the film. A lot of the film sort of like dealt with the post-colonial condition, which was sort of an overriding narrative throughout a lot of countries that were going through liberation at the time in the 60s. But what we do see in those films or experience is a complete sort of breakaway from sort of like the aesthetic constructs of how I think a lot of the world had understood cinema to be up until that point. In that they feel, there's you kind of like, also feel the authenticity with as far as the music is concerned in the film. And yeah, so I sort of kind of found this interesting, and I find that South Africa, for example, and South Africa's cinema, it's kind of a cinema that's very much concerned with the urban, with the urban environment. And I feel like there's also, we've had a lot of missed opportunities to sort of define our own cinema voice, or our own cinematic language, because it's kind of, it's continuously responding to this idea of what it means to be free. And so I think it's also, continuously evolving as well. So it's kind of very hard to pin down a South African sort of like cinema voice, whereas, the films of the 60s and 70s that emerged from West Africa are sort of canonical. You can watch one film and you can tell without knowing the filmmaker or the country it was made. You can say, oh, this is West African 70s. So I think it becomes really important to sort of ask questions around that, around identities, or sonic identities in film, how we sort of like represent ourselves through sound.
Thanks so much, Sifiso. So I'm not sure there are more questions out there. I don't see any hands, but I think that was just fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all of that, and I really look forward to maybe meet you here in Belgium or over there in South Africa. So thank you so much again for sharing, and I really hope to see you soon, and thanks everybody for staying until the very end, and we look forward to see you in the next seminar of our series. I think that's going to be all. Thank you so much. And
yeah, thank you once again for the opportunity.
yeah, take good care.
All
Thank
right.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Thanks, Sifiso.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.